Through women born without eyes, the most cruel face of consanguinity was revealed in the Appalachians, the result of generations of incest. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, in a remote region of Tennessee, this dark story begins in 1923. This was a period when the mountains served as natural barriers, isolating entire communities from the rest of civilization. A family became the epicenter of a genetic tragedy that would affect generations, in these lands forgotten by time, where the law rarely arrived. Known by local residents as the people of the shadows were the Caldwells. Since the late 18th century, they had been established in the mountains, occupying an isolated valley far from the nearest urban centers. The family lived from subsistence agriculture and hunting, led by patriarch Jedediah Caldwell, fiercely resisting any attempt to integrate with neighboring communities. But geographic insulation was only part of the problem. By the Caldwells, a deep contempt for the outside world was cultivated, fueled by old family stories about persecution and injustice. The perfect environment for a practice that would become its darkest legacy was created by this self-imposed isolation, marriage between close relatives. The mantra Jedediah repeated to her children and grandchildren was, "Pure blood keeps the family strong." In fact, this mistaken belief was not uncommon at that time and in that region. By necessity or tradition, many communities isolated in Appalachians practiced marriages between cousins. But to rarely documented extremes, the Caldwells took this practice. In 1925, a girl named Eliza was born to Jedediah's daughter, Marion Caldwell. Her own first cousin, Thomas Caldwell, was the child's father. Where the girl's eyes should be, a disturbing peculiarity was found. Only small empty cavities covered by a thin layer of skin were there. The midwife who assisted the childbirth was horrified, one of the few outsiders allowed on the property. But to evil spirits or a divine curse, the child's condition was attributed by the Caldwells. The ears of Dr. William Forrester, a doctor from the nearest city, eventually reached the news of the child born without eyes. Intrigued and worried, he tried to visit the family to examine the child, but with pointed shotguns and threats, he was received. The doctor, however, did not give up easily. For the next 5 years, rumors and reports about the Caldwells that came to him were carefully documented by him. In his diary, found decades later by researchers, Dr. Forrester wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that the Caldwells' condition is not the result of a curse, but of union between individuals of nearby blood ties. Science is already beginning to understand the dangers of such unions, although isolated communities remain ignorant of these facts." In 1931, another birth in the Caldwell family caught the eye. Twins were born to Martha Caldwell, Marion's cousin. With the same condition as Eliza, one of the girls was born, completely eyeless. The other had eyes, but other physical deformities were possessed, including cleft fingers and a severe spinal curvature. Dr. Forrester, upon learning of this new case, wrote to the Tennessee Health Department, warning about a possible public health crisis. Preserved in the state archives, his letter contains the first documented mention of what would later be known as Caldwell blindness. "We witness here the tragic result of isolation and ignorance," he wrote. "These children are victims not only of their physical conditions, but of family practices that perpetuate and amplify congenital defects through generations." The authorities' response was slow and inadequate. In 1932, a health officer was sent to investigate, but like Dr. Forrester, was prevented from entering the Caldwell property. That, in the absence of direct evidence and considering respect for local traditions, no additional action would be taken, concluded the official report. This was the first of many moments when the Caldwell children were failed by the system. Isolated from public scrutiny, the family would continue their consanguineous marriages during the following decades, while the number of children born with severe genetic deformities grew quietly. In 1934, the Great Depression hardly reached the region. Even rarer became the few interactions the Caldwells kept with the outside world, especially to sell furs and buy essential supplies. The family turned even further inward, deepening their isolation and mutual dependence. It was in this context that Jedediah Caldwell, then 70, established a rule that would seal the fate of future generations: no family member would be allowed to marry outsiders. "The world out there is dying," he declared. We will only survive by keeping our blood strong and pure. An isolated event in the history of the Appalachians was not the Caldwell tragedy. Other isolated communities have faced similar problems, though rarely so severe. The combination of extreme geographical isolation, a family ideology that actively promoted consanguinity, and persistent neglect by public authorities was what made the Caldwell case particularly devastating. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. An obscure side of American history that few people know is revealed by the story of the Caldwells, a dark secret hidden in the mountains that will forever change your vision of isolation and heredity. So you don't miss the next chapters of this exclusive investigation into the deepest secrets of the Appalachian Mountains, subscribe now. Significant changes to rural America were brought by the 1940s, but the Caldwell Valley remained practically untouched by progress. While the rest of the country faced World War II and experienced profound social transformations, its cycle of consanguineous isolation and reproduction was continued by the family, increasingly distant from the eyes of society. In 1943, a crucial event altered the family's fate. The only bridge that connected the Caldwell Valley to the outside world was destroyed by a strong storm. Now completely separated from civilization were the naturally isolated Caldwells. For most family members, this was not a calamity, but a blessing. Exactly the kind of isolation Jedediah had always wanted. By this time, Eliza Caldwell, the first eyeless child, was 18 years old. Despite her blindness, remarkable compensatory senses had been developed by her. So keen was his hearing that he could identify each family member only by the sound of their steps. His hands, trained to replace his absent eyes, were able to read the Earth's texture to predict climate change, a particularly valuable ability for a family of farmers. But beyond her congenital blindness, Eliza carried another burden. As later testimonials revealed, as a wife for her uncle, Joshua Caldwell, her father's younger brother, she had been chosen. Decided when she was still a child, this arrangement was part of Jedediah's strategy to strengthen the family lineage. When she turned 18, the marriage would be consummated, a practice that even at that time and in that isolated region would be considered abominable by wider society. It was Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt and one of the few people in the family that occasionally visited the city before the destruction of the bridge, who first began to question family practices. Conversations about bad blood and genetic weakness caused by relatives had been heard by her during her rare visits to the city. These ideas, even if understood in a rudimentary way, planted seeds of doubt in her mind. In the spring of 1943, when the preparations for Eliza's wedding began, Sarah confronted Jedediah. "Don't you see that you are condemning more children to be born like Eliza?" she would have asked. According to later reports from younger members of the family, Jedediah, furious with the questioning of his authority, expelled Sarah from the family meeting. Determined to prevent the marriage, Sarah did the unthinkable. She fled the valley, swimming across the river that now, without the bridge, represented a formidable barrier. Soaked and exhausted, arriving in the city, she sought out Dr. Forrester, who still maintained his interest in the Caldwell case even after more than a decade. The doctor, now an elderly man but still motivated by his professional ethics, immediately contacted the authorities. Unlike in 1932, this time the response was more decisive. America was at war, and the federal government was exercising unprecedented levels of authority over domestic affairs. An expedition to the Caldwell Valley was organized by a district prosecutor, accompanied by state police. A violent confrontation resulted from the intervention. In a shootout with the authorities, Jedediah and two of his sons were killed. The other family members, including Eliza, were removed from the valley and taken for medical and psychological evaluation. Pending an investigation, the Caldwell property was temporarily confiscated by the state. The extent of the damage caused by generations of consanguinity was revealed by the medical examination. Of the 32 people taken from the valley, 14 had significant deformities. In addition to the well-known eyeless children, cases of severe intellectual disability, heart malformations, and a variety of skeletal conditions were documented by doctors. A medical report of the time describes, "It is as if we were observing the results of a cruel experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguineous reproduction in humans." A case study in eugenics quickly became the Caldwell case, the now discredited science that advocated reproductive control to improve the human genetic pool. Unfortunately, the findings were often misunderstood and used to justify discriminatory policies against isolated rural communities. For Eliza and the other Caldwell women born without eyes, mixed results were brought by the intervention. On the one hand, they finally received adequate medical care and were protected from future forced consanguineous unions. On the other hand, many of them were admitted to state institutions for the disabled, where dehumanizing treatment was often received by them. Dr. Harold Jenkins, a University of Tennessee geneticist who studied the case in 1945, was the first to correctly identify the specific condition that afflicted the Caldwell women, congenital bilateral anophthalmia, the complete absence of eyes at birth. In his study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, 1 of the first volumes of this publication, he wrote, "The extraordinarily high prevalence of bilateral anophthalmia among Caldwell family women strongly suggests the presence of an X chromosome recessive gene which has been amplified through generations of consanguineous unions. In normal populations, the condition occurs in approximately 1 in 100,000 births. Among the Caldwells, the rate is approximately 1 in 3 female births, an alarming frequency that demonstrates vividly the dangers of prolonged consanguinity." Revolutionary at the time was Dr. Jenkins's study, establishing one of the first documented scientific connections between prolonged consanguinity and the dramatic increase in the expression of deleterious recessive genes. In discussions on public policies related to relatives, their findings would be cited in the following decades. Meanwhile, the lives of the Caldwell women continued. Eliza, who had never left the valley before, faced immense challenges of adaptation. Without the family milestones for which she had sailed in her familiar environment and without the social skills needed to interact with strangers, she initially entered a state of deep depression. It was a nurse named Margaret Wilson who finally managed to establish a connection with Eliza. Through months of patient work, Eliza was taught by Margaret to read Braille and use a cane to get around. Gradually, a new identity, separated from the oppressive traditions of her family, was begun to be developed by Eliza. In 1947, a detailed testimony about life in the Caldwell Valley was given by Eliza. Preserved in the state archives, this testimonial offers one of the few windows into the internal life of this isolated family. She described how, since she was a child, she was prepared for her role as a preserver of the lineage, and how children born with deformities were seen simultaneously as cursed and special, marked by God for a specific purpose within the family community. The beginning of a new era in the scientific understanding of human genetics was marked by the 1950s and, consequently, in the interpretation of the Caldwell case. The discovery of the DNA structure by Watson and Crick in 1953 revolutionized genetics, allowing scientists to start unraveling the molecular mechanisms behind hereditary conditions such as the anophthalmia of the Caldwell women. Dr. Richard Harmon, a geneticist at Harvard University, revisited the case in 1956 using the new theoretical tools available. A more precise mapping of the condition's inheritance pattern was allowed by his studies on medical records and Caldwell genealogical trees. In his seminal article, Inheritance Patterns in Genetic Isolates, The Caldwell Case, he wrote, "Analysis of the Caldwell genealogy reveals a classic X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. Men with their single X chromosome serve as carriers when affected but do not manifest the condition. Women with 2 X chromosomes manifest the condition only when they inherit the mutant gene from both parents. In exogamous populations with marriages outside the family group, such a coincidence would be extremely rare. However, after generations of consanguinity, the frequency of the mutant allele in the Caldwell genetic pool reached alarming levels, resulting in the high incidence of bilateral anophthalmia among family women. The condition of the Caldwell women was partially discussed by Dr. Harmon's work, moving the narrative from the dominion of superstition and moral judgment to the field of objective science. However, the women themselves continued to face prejudice and social isolation. In 1957, Eliza Caldwell, then 32, living in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee, was located by a journalist named Eleanor Patterson. One of the few Caldwell survivors able to transition to an independent life after years of institutionalization had been Eliza. With the help of charity organizations and some compassionate citizens, she had learned to weave baskets, a skill that allowed her to gain a modest income. The interview that Eleanor conducted with Eliza, published in Life magazine under the title The Woman Without Eyes, a survivor of the mountains, brought national attention to the Caldwell case. For the first time, a first-person narrative about the effects of extreme consanguinity was accessed by the American audience. "Many people think I was born in darkness," Eliza was quoted as saying. "But I had my own form of light. I knew every sound, every smell, every curve of the valley. It was my world. What truly plunged me into darkness was finding the truth about my family, that we were not special or chosen, as we were told, but victims of ignorance and isolation." Impactful photographs of Eliza showing her profile face with the empty eye orbits delicately covered by permanently closed eyelids were included in the report. The images shocked middle-class America of the 1950s, causing discussions about rural health, geographical isolation, and the dangers of endogamy. It was after this report that an informal support group was formed by several of the surviving Caldwell women beginning to meet. Martha Caldwell, one of the twins born in 1931, emerged as the leader of this group. Unlike her sister, who had died as a young woman due to heart complications related to her multiple genetic conditions, Martha had survived and developed considerable resilience. Using a recorder donated by a local church, Martha began to collect the testimonies of the survivors. Later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archive, these recordings constitute an invaluable resource for understanding life within the isolated Caldwell community. In one of the most disturbing recordings, Ruth Caldwell, born in 1939 and also without eyes, describes what it was like to be prepared from childhood to marry her uncle. "They told us that we were special vessels chosen to carry the pure blood of the family. Our blindness was seen as a sign that we belonged only to the family, that we should never look to the outside world. We believed it. How could we not believe it? It was all we knew." Have you ever wondered what it would be like to grow up in complete isolation? Believing that your genetic condition was a blessing and not a curse? Leave in the comments, "Isolation kills," if you believe that access to education and health could have avoided this tragedy. The recordings also reveal how the Caldwell family had developed its own mythology to explain and justify their practices. Inner seers were what the eyeless women were called, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to those with physical vision. This mystical interpretation of their condition served to raise their status within the family, even while preparing them for a life of reproductive submission. During the 1960s, the attention of anthropologists and sociologists interested in the dynamics of isolated communities began to be attracted by the Caldwell case. Dr. Thomas Bennett of the University of Chicago spent 3 years studying the case records and interviewing the survivors. His 1968 book, The Inhabitants of the Valley, Isolation, Consanguinity, and Culture in Appalachia, became a seminal work in the field. Bennett argued that the Caldwell case should not be seen simply as an aberration or as a result of superstition and ignorance, but as the extreme product of social, economic, and geographical forces that shaped many Appalachian communities. The Caldwells represent an extreme but not unique case throughout the Appalachians. Geographical isolation, poverty, and historical distrust of external authorities have created conditions for the development of endogamous communities. When we combine these factors with the lack of access to education and healthcare, we create fertile ground for tragedies such as the Caldwells. Revolutionary was Bennett's work in contextualizing the case within a broader sociological analysis, rather than treating it as a medical curiosity or a sensationalist narrative about rural degeneration, the approach that had dominated previous discussions. In 1965, back to public attention was brought the Caldwell case by an unexpected tragedy. Eliza Caldwell, then 40, was found dead in her apartment in Knoxville. The investigation concluded that she had committed suicide, leaving a brief note that said only, "I got tired of being an example, a study case, a lesson. I just want to be remembered as a woman." A re-evaluation of the way Caldwell survivors had been treated by the medical system and the media was caused by his death. Many began to question whether the constant exposure and clinical analysis of their lives was not a form of exploitation that perpetuated their suffering in another format. The 1970s brought important advances in the scientific understanding of the Caldwell case in parallel to significant changes in the survivors' lives. With the development of more sophisticated techniques of genetic analysis, the specific mutation responsible for the anophthalmia of the Caldwell women was able to be identified for the first time by researchers at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Michael Stern, the study's leader, published his findings in 1973 in the prestigious Journal of Medical Genetics. A mutation in the SOX3 gene, located on the X chromosome, was identified by his research as the likely cause of the condition. Revolutionary was this discovery, representing one of the first cases in which a complex human genetic condition was tracked to a specific mutation. The Caldwell mutation, as we are calling it, offers an unprecedented glimpse into the molecular mechanisms of human eye development, Dr. Stern wrote. The fact that this mutation is rarely observed in general populations but has reached high frequency in the Caldwell family serves as a powerful example of the effects of the founder effect amplified by generations of consanguineous marriages. A genetic principle by which the loss of genetic variation occurs when a new population is established by a very small number of individuals is the founder effect to which Dr. Stern referred, as was the case when Jedediah Caldwell and his original family isolated themselves in the mountains. When combined with repeated consanguineous marriages, this effect can lead to the high expression of rare genetic traits. Exactly what happened with anophthalmia among the Caldwell women. While science advanced in the technical understanding of the case, the Caldwell survivors continued their personal journeys. Martha Caldwell, who had emerged as the group's informal spokesman, was invited in 1974 to speak at a rural health conference in Washington, D.C. Beyond Darkness. The Experienced Experience of Consanguinity was the title of her presentation, the first time one of the Caldwell women was able to speak directly to the medical and political community. In her speech, preserved in audio in the conference archives, Martha challenged the predominant narrative. You have studied us as specimens, catalogued our deformities, mapped our genes, but rarely asked what it is like to live in our bodies, our minds. We are not just examples of defective genetics. We are women with hope, fears, and dreams. And yes, we are survivors not only of our biology, but of a system of beliefs that valued purity above health and well-being. A significant impact was had by Martha's discourse, inspiring a new, more humanistic approach to the study of communities affected by genetic conditions. She was later invited to contribute to the development of educational materials about the risks of consanguinity intended for isolated rural communities. In 1976, another layer to the history of the Caldwells was added by a surprising discovery. During a survey of the archives of a local church, parish records dating from 1798 that documented the arrival of Ezekiel Caldwell, the father of Jedediah, to the region were found by historian Robert Williams. The records revealed that from his home county in North Carolina, Ezekiel had run away after being accused of nature practices, a euphemism commonly used for incestuous relationships. This discovery suggested that the Caldwells' consanguineous practices preceded their isolation in the Appalachian Mountains, reversing the previous causal understanding. It was not simply the isolation that led to consanguinity, but possibly the reverse. The family sought isolation to continue practices that were already considered taboo even in the most permissive standards of the late 18th century. In his book Buried Roots, The True Origin of the Caldwell Tragedy, historian Williams argued that this broader historical context was crucial to completely understanding the case. The Caldwells were not simply victims of geographical circumstances and ignorance as they were often portrayed. Their history begins with a deliberate choice of isolation to escape social scrutiny, followed by the construction of a system of beliefs that justified and sustained practices that they knew to be condemned by the wider society. This is not a simple history of environmental determinism, but of complex interactions between choice, circumstance, and consequence through generations. Intense debates between academics and public commentators were caused by this historical reassessment. Some criticized Williams for reducing the socio-economic and geographical factors that shaped the Caldwell community, while others praised his approach to restoring the family's historic agency rather than simply portraying them as passive victims of their environment. In 1978, To an even larger national audience was brought the case by a documentary produced by PBS entitled In the Shadows of the Mountains, The Caldwell History. The documentary included interviews with Martha and other survivors, as well as with doctors, geneticists, and historians who had studied the case over the decades. One of the most striking scenes of the documentary showed Martha Caldwell returning to the valley where she grew up, now abandoned and partially claimed by the forest. Walking with the help of a cane, she navigated the ground with surprising ease, resorting to tactile and auditory memories of her childhood. "Here," she said, stopping at a specific point. "It was where we sat at night to hear our grandfather Jedediah's stories about our ancestors. He told us that we were special, chosen to preserve something precious that the outside world would never understand. As children, we believed it was a privilege. Only later we understood it was a prison." An Emmy was won by the documentary and renewed public interest in the case was generated. This interest coincided with broader debates on reproductive rights, consent, and the limits of government intervention in cultural and family practices, topics that dominated the American public discourse of the 1970s. For the Caldwell survivors, now middle-aged women, this renewed attention brought opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, offers for advanced medical treatments were received by several of them, including cosmetic eye prostheses that could improve their physical appearance, even if they did not restore their vision. On the other hand, fatigue with the continuous public and scientific scrutiny of their lives was expressed by many. Ruth Caldwell, in a rarely granted interview to Time magazine in 1979, expressed this ambivalence. "We have spent our lives being stuck," Martha often explained in her presentations to rural communities. "We are here to share information that was not available to our family. Knowledge that could have avoided so much suffering." The effectiveness of these educational efforts is difficult to quantify, but anecdotal reports suggest that they contributed to a reduction in the incidence of marriages among close relatives in several isolated communities. The discussion about consanguinity was also helped to be destigmatized by the Foundation's work, transforming it from a shameful taboo into a public health topic that could be openly approached. In 1983, Martha was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on rural health. Instrumental in allocating federal funds for medical extension programs in remote regions of Appalachia was her eloquent testimony about the long-term consequences of geographical isolation and lack of access to health and education services. "The mountains that isolated us are not only geographical but also economic and social," she told the legislators. "To break the isolation cycle that leads to practices like those that destroyed my family, we need to build bridges. Not just physical bridges, but bridges of knowledge, care, and understanding." While Martha was dedicated to public activism, other Caldwell survivors chose different paths. Ruth Caldwell, who had expressed discomfort with public attention, found purpose in working with blind children. Using her own vision-free navigation experience, she became a respected instructor at a school for the blind in Nashville, where she taught generations of children how to develop their tactile and hearing perceptions. In an interview with a local newspaper in 1984, Ruth reflected on her journey. "For a long time, I thought of my condition just as a curse, a burden that I carried due to the mistakes of my ancestors. But through my work with these children, I began to see my experience as a source of unique wisdom. I can teach from a place of genuine understanding that other instructors, even the most dedicated, simply don't have." In 1985, back to national attention were brought the Caldwell survivors by a significant event. Dr. James Harrison, a neurologist specializing in sensory perception, published a revolutionary study on the extraordinary hearing and tactile abilities developed by the eyeless Caldwell women. His study, published in the journal Nature, documented how these women had developed areas of the cerebral cortex typically dedicated to visual processing to amplify other senses. Patterns of neural activity that challenged earlier understandings about brain plasticity and sensory adaptation were revealed by brain scans of Martha, Ruth, and 3 other Caldwell survivors. Dr. Harrison concluded that the Caldwell women had effectively redesigned their brains in response to their congenital condition, developing sensory abilities that rivaled or exceeded those documented in individuals who lost vision later in life. The Caldwell brain, as it was informally called in the subsequent scientific literature, became an Important case of study in neuroplasticity. A natural laboratory for the study of human brain adaptation had been inadvertently created by what began as a genetic tragedy. Always pragmatic, Martha commented on these findings in an interview with Scientific American magazine. "It is a comfort to know that something useful for science has come from our pain. But let us not be mistaken. No scientific discovery is worth the price our family paid. If you could choose, you would exchange all this scientific knowledge for a normal childhood for each of us." In 1987, another layer to the already complex history of the Caldwells was added by an unexpected development. A woman named Rebecca Miller, 25, contacted the Caldwell Foundation claiming to be a descendant of Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt, who had warned the authorities about family practices in 1943. According to Rebecca, her grandmother Sarah had left Tennessee after the incident, settling in the West, where she changed her name and rarely talked about her past. Only on her deathbed in 1986 had Sarah revealed her true identity to the family and handed over to Rebecca a diary kept during her years with the Caldwells. Sarah's diary, subsequently donated to the Tennessee Historical Archive, offered an extraordinary window into everyday life in the isolated Caldwell community during the 1920s and 1930s. Written in a meticulous handwriting, the diary detailed not only the family's consanguineous practices but also the complex belief system that supported them. Sarah described how Jedediah Caldwell had developed an idiosyncratic theology that mixed elements of fundamentalist Christianity with the folkloric traditions of the Appalachians and his own mystical interpretations. This theology positioned the Caldwells as a chosen lineage whose blood should remain undiluted by the outside world. Particularly disturbing was Sarah's account of how the women born without eyes were treated. Far from being hidden or neglected, they were celebrated as inner seers, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to normal people. This veneration, however, coexisted with their exploitation as perpetuators of the sacred lineage, a euphemism for their role as reproductive vessels in arranged consanguineous unions. The diary also revealed that Sarah had tried several times before 1943 to warn authorities about the situation, but was ignored or not taken seriously. Only when Eliza's situation became imminent, her forced marriage to her uncle was scheduled to take place in a week, did Sarah make her desperate escape. The publication of an edited version of the diary in 1988 under the title Witness in the Valley, Sarah Caldwell's diary became a national bestseller, inspiring renewed discussions on cultural isolation, patriarchal authority, and the role of women in closed communities. The book also provoked debates about the authorities' responsibility to intervene in harmful cultural practices, even when they occur in isolated communities that actively resist external interference. For Martha and the other Caldwell survivors, late validation was offered by Sarah's diary. For decades, we struggled for people to believe the extent and systematic nature of what happened in our valley, Martha commented when the book was released. Sarah's diary confirms what we always knew, but also reveals how much sooner our tragedy could have been interrupted if anyone had listened. By the late 1980s, the Caldwell case had passed from obscurity to become part of the canon of case studies in medical genetics, neuroscience, and cultural anthropology. The survivors, now elderly women, had found various ways to reconcile with their past and build significant lives despite their traumatic experiences. Martha Caldwell continued her work with the foundation until her death in 1991 at 60. Not only the remaining few survivors but also dozens of medical professionals, researchers, and activists whose careers and perspectives had been deeply influenced by her work and testimony were attended at her funeral. Martha's obituary in the New York Times described her as a woman who turned a dark inheritance into an illuminating mission. The text continued, "Born without eyes due to generations of consanguineous marriages, Martha Caldwell dedicated her life to ensuring that other communities did not repeat the mistakes that devastated her family. Her legacy lives not only in the field of medical genetics, where the Caldwell case remains a seminal study, but in the numerous families that, thanks to her educational efforts, were spared similar suffering." Ruth Caldwell continued her work with blind children until her retirement in 1994, receiving multiple recognitions for her pioneering contributions to sensory teaching techniques. She died in 1998 at the age of 59, leaving a legacy of pedagogical innovation that continues to influence the education of children with visual impairment. The scientific discoveries related to the Caldwell case continued in the following decades. In 1995, the specific genetic mutation responsible for the anophthalmia of the Caldwell women was accurately identified by researchers at the University of Michigan, a SOX3 gene deletion that affects early eye development. This finding contributed significantly to the understanding of the embryonic development of human eyes. In 2002, a comprehensive study published by geneticist Dr. Lawrence Klein analyzed the DNA of more than 200 indirect descendants of the Caldwells spread throughout the United States. The study revealed that approximately 1 out of 40 residents of certain regions of Appalachia carries the Caldwell mutation in recessive form, a silent testimony to the dispersion of family genes through the following generations. A powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, scientific ignorance, and harmful traditions perpetuated in the name of purity or preservation remains the Caldwell case. But it is also a history of extraordinary human resilience, adaptation, and the ability to transform personal suffering into social advancement. The women who were born without eyes in the Appalachians, victims of generations of consanguinity, eventually found ways to see beyond the limitations imposed by their genetics and culture. Through their testimonies, activism, and simply through their lives lived with dignity, they illuminated dark corners of human experience and contributed to a more informed and compassionate world. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the perfect time to join our community and discover more amazing and impactful stories like this. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives that reveal the darkest secrets of human experience. Don't forget to leave your like and share with friends who also enjoy real and impactful stories. The mountains keep many other secrets, and we will be here to reveal them to you one chapter at a time.